I never expected to spend the last real assignment of my career apologizing to a slab of rock, but that is exactly how I would eventually explain it to the review board, if any of them believed me. We were the Wintermere, out of Port Calendry, a marine survey hull built for charting reefs and drowned forests along coastlines nobody had bothered to finish mapping. My name is Ellen Voss. I was 51 years old and the ship's archivist, the woman who catalogs whatever the divers and dredge crews drag up, who transcribes the old inscriptions nobody else has the patience to sit with, who keeps the record straight when everyone else has moved on to the next find. It is not glamorous work. Most of my career has been spent hunched over a folding table under a bad lamp, matching broken syllables to older broken syllables, while younger crew went out in the launches and came back with sunburns and stories. It is careful work though, and I have always believed careful and glamorous are not the same thing, and that most of what lasts in this world was built by people willing to do the first without ever getting the second. The waters we were charting that autumn had a name on the old paper charts, crossed out in 3 different centuries of ink: the unlisted water. Sailors who still spoke of it called it that on purpose, the way you would name a debt you intended never to collect. There was a shoal chain out past the permanent fog line that no survey had properly finished since before my grandmother was born. And somewhere among the sea stacks, according to 3 separate wrecked ship logs I had personally transcribed over the years, one from a lost timber schooner, one from a naval sloop that never should have been that far north, one from a fishing crew who wrote it up as a joke and then, reading between their own lines, clearly did not think it was funny at all, stood something the old hands called the Fenwarden, a standing shape, man-tall times 10, that some captains swore had turned its head to watch them pass, and others swore was only strange erosion and bad nerves working on tired men in bad light. Captain Ril Adeyemi did not believe in the Fenwarden. He believed in charts, and the chart had a hole in it, and the company wanted the hole filled before the shipping lanes moved north for the winter season. That is the whole reason we were out there. It had nothing to do with legends, and I want that understood clearly, because what happened afterward had even less to do with legends and everything to do with habit, my habit, specifically, the same small stubborn one I had been practicing, unglamorously, for 30 years before any of it mattered to anyone. The fog took us on the 11th night. I remember the specific quality of it, not a mist you could see through in patches, the way fog usually works, but a wall, gray and total, that swallowed our running lights within arm's reach of the hull. Des Okafor, our engineer, said afterward that the engines never actually failed. The water simply stopped behaving like water, thick and slow around the screws, the way syrup resists a spoon no matter how hard you push it. We struck the outer shoal a little after 4 in the morning. I was thrown clean out of my bunk into the archive locker, and when I picked myself up off the floor, half the specimen drawers had emptied across my legs. Slate fragments, corroded pins, ring-bound notebooks, a decade of somebody else's careful cataloging scattered across the deck plating like spilled coins. We ran the Wintermere aground on purpose rather than let her take on water and sink under us in open sea, and by first light we had beached her prow first on a black shingle shore beneath cliffs that did not appear on any chart I had ever transcribed, not once, not in 3 centuries of crossed-out ink. The fog thinned enough by mid-morning to see maybe 200 yards in any direction, which was more than enough to see the shape standing at the top of the shore. It stood where the cliff met the shingle, waist-deep in old rock the way a fence post is set in concrete, though I understood within the hour of studying it that the rock had grown up slowly around its base over some span of time I did not particularly want to guess at. It was carved, unmistakably carved, not eroded, the tool marks still visible in the stone despite whatever centuries of weather had been thrown at it since, into the shape of a robed figure with its hands folded before it and its head bowed slightly forward, as if listening for something very far away that had not yet arrived. Its eyes were open. They had always been open, that much was plain in the carving itself, wide and calm and fixed out on the water beyond the wreck of our ship, and there was nothing frightening in that stillness, except the plain fact of its size, which made every one of us feel like something that had wandered in uninvited to a room built for someone much older. We spent that first full day doing what any sensible crew does after a wreck. Took inventory, rigged a signal mast from the foremast timber, and argued, quietly and without much heat, about whether the standing shape on the cliff was a landmark, a hazard, or nothing at all worth troubling ourselves over. Adeyemi walked the shingle twice with a hand level and a notepad, treating it the way he treated every unmapped feature on any coastline, as a measurement problem first, a mystery only if the measurements themselves refused to add up cleanly. They did not add up cleanly. He recorded a height estimate, revised it twice, and finally wrote down a number he did not fully believe himself and moved on, because that is what a good survey captain does with a thing too large to argue with in the time available. Adeyemi wanted it logged, photographed, and left strictly alone until we could raise a proper shore party with the right equipment, which was the correct call, and I want that on the record, whatever record this ends up being. What happened instead is that Petty Officer Okafor, standing first watch on the beach that evening with the fog rolling back in off the water, saw the shape's silhouette shift, nothing more, almost certainly, than the fog thickening and thinning around it in the wind, and put 2 rounds from his service rifle into its chest before anyone could reach him or stop him in time. I do not blame him for it, not truly, and I have said so to his face more than once since. We were 400 miles from the nearest charted water, our ship was wrecked under us with no working radio, and something the size of a cathedral had a face that never once looked away. I would like to say that I stayed calm through all of it. What I actually did, an hour before the shots, was drop the slate fragment I had been transcribing by lantern light at the base of the statue itself. I had gone out at dusk against every rule of the expedition, because a piece of it, a broken plate no bigger than a dinner tray, had inscriptions on it I recognized from the same 3 ships' logs I had spent years with, and I could not make myself wait until morning to know whether I was right about what it said. Nothing happened when the rifle fired. That is the part that still unsettles me more than anything that came after it. The shots rang out flat and enormous across that whole black shore, and the great carved thing did not so much as shed a single flake of stone in answer. It simply stood, exactly as it had stood the hour before and the century before that, patient in a way no living thing manages to be patient, while 4 grown adults with training and discipline stood shoulder to shoulder with their hearts going and waited for a monster that plainly had no intention of arriving. What arrived instead was quieter, and it arrived because of me, not because of the rifle, and I have had a great deal of time since to sit with what that means. I had been reading the plate by lantern light with my transcription notebook balanced on my knee, doing what I do with every fragment that ever crosses my table regardless of the hour or the circumstances around it, sounding it out. Not translating in my head and writing down only the meaning, which is a shortcut and a bad habit I have spent 30 careful years refusing to let myself take, no matter how tired or cold or frightened I happen to be. I read the old syllables aloud, the way you have to if you actually want to know whether your transcription is right, because the ear catches what the eye slides past every single time. I had done this with cargo manifests and temple ledgers and a dead language's grocery lists and, once, memorably, someone's 400-year-old tax complaint. I had never once expected it to matter to anything beyond my own notebook and my own small professional pride. The words on the plate sounded out slow and awkward in a dead tongue I had spent a decade learning to read but had almost never spoken aloud in full, turned out to be a simple thing. A greeting formula, the kind carved on the threshold of a house, meant for whoever crossed it, keeper or stranger alike, asking nothing more than to be acknowledged honestly before stepping inside. I set it to the dark because that is what you do with a threshold inscription. Out of habit, and a kind of stubborn professional respect and nothing grander than that. The way you might knock before entering an old church even long after you had stopped believing in what it was built for. The ground did not shake. I want to be precise about that, because when I have told this since, to the handful of people who will sit still and listen, people always expect thunder. What happened instead was smaller, and I think now, worse. A single hairline seam along the statue's folded hands began to warm. Not glow exactly at first, just a change in the color of the stone the way a coal changes color the moment you breathe on it. The warmth climbed. It found the wrists, then the forearms, then the deep carved folds of the robe, tracing every line the sculptor had cut 1,000 years or 10,000 years before, until the whole standing shape wore a faint, banked amber light, like a lamp glowing behind frosted glass in a house you thought was empty. The bowed head did not lift, not fully. It simply, slowly, turned those open stone eyes downward, off the water it had been watching since long before any of our nations had names, and settled them on me, and only me, the way a held breath settles once it finally finds somewhere to go. Okafor had reloaded by then. I heard the bolt work behind me in the dark and I put my hand up without turning around, which is not a brave gesture. It is simply the only thing my body decided to do on its own, while the rest of me stood there useless. The voice, when it came, was not loud. I want that understood too, because it matters. It did not need to be loud. It seemed to come from everywhere the light had reached at once, low and even, like something spoken across a very long distance that had finally arrived at the place it had been going the whole time. Wardenkin, the vigil ends with you. I did not understand it as a sentence right away. I understood it the way you understand a name called across a crowded room before you consciously understand it as your own name. A jolt low in the body first, meaning arriving a clumsy half-second behind. Adeyemi asked me, carefully, keeping his own voice level in a way I have thought about often since, what it had said to me. I told him plainly, word for word, my hands still shaking around the notebook. Nobody laughed, which tells you something about the state we were all in by then. 4 strangers on a wrecked ship's crew standing on a black beach at the edge of the world. It did not move again that night, though the amber light stayed banked in its folded hands and its wrists for hours afterward, slowly dimming the way embers dim, rather than the way a switch simply turns off. Okafor sat with me until dawn, not saying much, though at one point he asked, quietly, whether I thought it had heard the shots at all, or only heard me. I told him I honestly did not know, and that I was not sure it mattered anymore which one came first. By the time the fog properly lifted at true dawn, there was nothing left to point a camera at except a very old, very still statue, standing exactly as it had for however many centuries, its eyes once again fixed out on the water. Except that I knew, the way you know a room has been quietly rearranged even before you can say what moved in it, that it was not watching the water in the same way anymore. It was watching the way a man watches a door he has finally been given a reason to expect someone walking back through. We were pulled off the shoals 11 days later by a relief vessel that had triangulated our last transmission before the wreck, and those 11 days passed the way I imagine a held vigil always passes. Quietly, without drama, rationed water and salvaged tarps and long hours of nothing happening at all, near a thing none of us any longer feared. Okafor took to sitting near the base of the statue in the evenings with his rifle slung and unloaded, which none of us remarked on, and Adeyemi finished his survey of the shoreline as though the wreck had always been the plan, filling in a chart no company would ever officially credit him for completing. I spent most of those days back at the plate, cross-checking every character against the fragments I had brought with me, filling 3 notebooks with cross-references nobody but me would ever ask to see, because that, in the end, is the only part of any of this I have ever fully known how to do. The official report I filed afterward for the survey company describes an unusual rock formation, a minor seismic event, and crew stress under difficult conditions, because that is the report a 51-year-old archivist files if she intends to keep both her clearance and her pension intact. I have never filed the other report. I am not entirely sure there exists a form for it anywhere in the company's system. What I can tell you, because nobody at the company will ever trouble themselves to read this, and because I think somebody besides me ought to know it plainly stated at least once. I went back, once we were home, and read every fragment of that dead tongue I had transcribed across my whole career, all the way back to my earliest training years, and I found the word again and again, in places where I had carefully translated around it, rather than straight through it. A formal address, a title given only to the one who keeps a threshold's memory alive faithfully enough, and long enough, that someone worth answering to eventually arrives to claim it. It is not a bloodline. I checked that thoroughly, as much as such a thing can honestly be checked from old paper. It is a habit of care, carried faithfully forward long enough, by enough patient hands passing it on without expecting anything back, that eventually the last hand still holding it happens to be standing in the right doorway on the one night the door finally, quietly opens. I do not know what the vigil was originally for. I do not know what the Fen Warden was built to watch, out past that shoal, in water that still does not appear correctly on any chart I have access to, in any archive, under any name. I know only that something stood alone in the fog for longer than any nation I belong to has ever existed, that 4 uninvited strangers came ashore in the space of one bad night, and one of them shot it out of plain human fear, and that it answered that fear, in the end, with my own careless, ordinary habit of reading a stranger's forgotten words aloud with a little respect, because that is simply what I have always done, without thinking twice about it, with anything old enough to have been forgotten by everyone else but me. I have put in for transfer back to that stretch of water twice now. The company has not approved it either time, and may never. I keep the transcription notebook on my desk regardless, the plate's inscription copied out fair in the front of it in my own steady hand, and some nights, when the apartment is quiet and the traffic outside is finally thinned down to nothing, I take it out and read the old greeting aloud again, slowly, the exact way I was taught 3 decades ago by people who never once raised their voices either. Not because I expect any answer this far from that shore. I read it because a vigil, once it has truly become yours, does not particularly care how far away you have gone in the meantime. It only cares that you keep it, quietly, the way it was always meant to be kept, for as long as it takes for the door to matter again. That is the whole of what I know, and I have told it now exactly once, the only way the old plate ever asked to be read, plainly, aloud, and with a measure of respect for whoever might still be listening on the other side of it.